turn it over to Professor Keith Parmiter. He's our moderator for tonight's debate. And I'd also like to point out that we do have a Q&A session planned. We have
Our format for tonight is fairly straightforward. We're going to go through 4 questions on the topics for today, which are voter ID, restrictions, and immigration, and how those issues cross over. I have to commend you all, though. This is a really excellent turnout for a rainy Thursday night. I'm glad that you all have the wherewithal to be with us tonight, and we hope to make it an interesting hour for you. And part of the goal here is to reserve time for you to ask questions. As Trevor mentioned, there are note cards. Please, if you think of a question, write it down. We'll collect them at the end of the formal debate section of this hour. Hopefully we'll break at about the 40-minute mark and then open it up to you for your questions. So let me just tell you a little bit about our speakers for this evening. J.Christian Adams is joining us. Just came into town, and we appreciate his coming. He's the President and General Counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. He's also the founder of the Election Law Center. From 2005 to 2010, he served in the voting section of the United States Department of Justice, and he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Injustice, Exposing the Racial Agenda of the Obama Justice Department. So we welcome Mr. Adams. And to my left here is Professor Gilbert Carrasco. Professor Carrasco is an expert in civil rights law, immigration, and constitutional law. He's the author of 3 national case books. And he served as a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department. And he serves on the board of directors of the Oregon chapter of the American Constitution Society. So we welcome both speakers and look forward to a lively debate. Each side will have 5 minutes per question. We'll start out with the first question. I will gently give you both some time reminders, and hopefully we can stick to the schedule to get through as much time as possible. I feel like this is the closest I'm ever going to be to being Anderson Cooper. Me too. All right, so the first question we will start is to Professor Carrasco. Professor Carrasco, it has long been a federal crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Given this legal fact, what is unreasonable about requiring a voter to show proof, such as through birth certificate or driver's license, that the voter is legally entitled to vote? You have 5 minutes.
Okay, well, first of all, the United States Constitution does not require citizenship to vote. Indeed, until 1922, 21 states did not require citizenship to vote. That being said, now all the states do require it, and indeed it's a federal crime to vote without authorization or eligibility. And in many states, including Indiana, it's also a crime, a felony indeed, in Indiana to vote without eligibility. So there's plenty of disincentive with respect to people voting without eligibility. Federal law requires no proof of citizenship to vote. In fact, the National Voters Registration Act is testament to that. Essentially, the Act provides for a federal form that contains the statutory requirements that have to be met under the Act for people to register to vote. And they need only attest that they are citizens, and they have to sign under penalty of perjury to that effect. And that's been the historical situation for voting in this country. The state of Arizona actually required proof of citizenship without seeking to amend the federal form for use in their state, and the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, 2013 case, decided that the Arizona statute was preempted by the NVRA and held it unlawful. In terms of the question, is it reasonable to ask people to provide proof of voting eligibility? Well, for most people it is reasonable. For most people, it doesn't pose a problem. However, as long ago as 1789, James Madison was of the view that we need to protect against the tyranny of the majority. And so, with respect to voting requirements, the answer is no. It's not reasonable to require all poor or old or disabled people to provide any documentation before they cast a vote. Now, illustrative of this is some of the facts in the Crawford versus Marion County Board of Elections case, which was a Supreme Court case decided in 2008. And in that case, a voter ID requirement in Indiana was at issue. And the court found that out of 92 Indiana counties, 21 of them had no public transportation. And that reflected 1 of 10 voters who lived in these 21 non-public transportation counties. Now, that may not be a problem for those who have cars, who have driver's licenses, but to get to a Department of Motor Vehicles is a question, is a challenge for some people, particularly the disabled, the poor, and the elderly. Moreover, birth certificates in Indiana at the time cost between $3 and $12, and a passport, another form of acceptable ID, cost $100. This situation is really commonly the case in many jurisdictions, and in July, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit decided that voter ID was unlawful. Essentially, some of the facts indicated there that for out-of-state birth certificates, it could cost between $42 and $81. That was applicable to a person with a fixed income, monthly income of $321. Some people had to commute an hour to get to the nearest Department of Public Safety office where they could get a voter ID. And in some cases, it was 60 miles round trip. And if you have a car, that may not be very much, but if you don't, it could be a problem. Almost 5% of the registered voters lack the requisite ID in Texas. That's over 600,000 people. So there are a variety of findings that the court issued, and in light of the time, I will not go into those findings, but in any event, one of the things that I think I should mention is that in Vesey there was no evidence whatsoever that voting by the undocumented was ever a problem.
All right, thank you, Professor Carrasco. Mr. Adams, same question. Is it unreasonable to require people to show ID given that it's been a federal crime for quite some time for non-citizens to vote?
Yes, first of all, I'm thrilled you guys are all here. I was supposed to be in the United States District Court today to argue a summary judgment motion on the issue of citizenship verification in the United States District Court in D.C. Also, there is a baseball game tonight. My favorite baseball team playing the Dodgers. And so I'm thankful you guys all actually came. It would be very depressing if you didn't. Okay. First of all, the Constitution vests control in the states to make up their own election system. Okay, that's the first starting point. That's why Oregon has such a different way of doing elections, because the Constitution gives the states the power to control their own elections. I took the question to focus mostly on citizenship issues. We're going to talk about voter ID in another question, so let me address citizenship issues first. Americans should be picking American leaders, period. I think everybody pretty much agrees with that. But the problem is that non-citizens are getting on the rolls in very, very large numbers and casting ballots. For example, a study by Old Dominion University, which I'm not sure is wholly accurate, had an astonishing number of non-citizens on the rolls and casting ballots. But I can tell you about a study I just did. In Virginia, just looking at 8 counties, not all 135, we found over 1,000 aliens had gotten on the rolls, over almost 300 ballots were cast by those individuals. Now you can say, well, that's only 300 ballots. Our Attorney General's race was decided by 164 votes 2 years ago, okay? And that's only 8 counties. So the point is that non-citizens are getting on the rolls and voting, and that is a federal felony. Should they be required to show proof that the voter is legally entitled to vote? In some states, there's proof of citizenship requirement, a birth certificate. If you don't have it, you can have a hearing with the state election officials saying, yes, I was born here, and swear under oath that you're a citizen. The problem is that the system is failing now to stop non-citizens from getting on the rolls. It's failing in large numbers. Your votes, I assume most of you guys are citizens, if not all of you, your votes get canceled out every time a non-citizen votes. So, whose vote do you want to give up? Your vote, my vote, for a non-citizen voting. This is a real problem. I told you about one study. In Pennsylvania, we looked at the city of Philadelphia and found, and these were only non-citizens, by the way, who admitted they were non-citizens and told the election officials, take me off the rolls, or told DMV the second time they filled out a form, no, I'm not a citizen. Remember, the first time they said, yes, I'm a citizen. The second time they said no, and they got caught. These are federal felonies. These are state felonies. So what do we do about non-citizens getting on the rolls? There's a couple of solutions. One, proof of citizenship. That's what the first question was about. Is it reasonable to show that you're eligible to vote? Passport, birth certificate, some other, military record, something like that. But even if you don't require that, there's other tools to deal with this. There's databases such as the SAVE database. It's a federal DHS database. Anytime a non-citizen touches the immigration system, caught at the border, applying for green card, gets green card, applying for visa, any of those people are in the SAVE database. You might wonder why it's called SAVE. Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements. Okay? And under federal law, every state has access to the SAVE database. But very few states are using this database to detect non-citizens on their voter rolls. And that's why we have the problem that we have. There's other tools that could be used. You know how many people get out of jury duty by saying, I don't have to serve because I'm a non-citizen? It's astonishing. If you were to go down to the federal courthouse and just tool around, you could see that. And so that tool of collecting jury data, people who say, I'm not a U.S. citizen, let me out of jury duty, election officials aren't using that information adequately. Some are, but very few are. And so the point is there's another tool. And the other way you prevent non-citizens from participating in American elections is to prosecute them when they're caught. That's the other thing. I doubt you will find very many prosecutions of aliens voting in federal elections because people aren't bringing the cases. They exist, they're caught all the time, but they're not being prosecuted. So the question is it reasonable to ask somebody to verify that they're eligible to vote? Well, if you don't, what do you get? You get more people who aren't eligible to vote voting. So you find a way to do it that is cheap, easy, free, and doesn't prevent people who are otherwise entitled from voting. I think that's something that most Americans agree on.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adams. We'll switch gears slightly and also switch the order and pose this question out of Mr. Adams. Earlier this year, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down North Carolina's voter ID law. That law placed limits on early voting and same-day registration, as well as additional requirements for what ID is acceptable or not. In its opinion striking down North Carolina's law, the Fourth Circuit ruled that North Carolina's new voter restrictions, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision and impose cures for problems that did not exist, end quote. Given this ruling and other rulings against voter ID laws in other states, what evidence is there that the nation is suffering from widespread voter ID fraud?
Okay, well, let's start with the premise of the question. There's a lot of quotes embedded in that question from the Court of Appeals ruling, but there weren't many quotes from the trial court ruling, which came to the exact opposite conclusions. And so realize that there is a massive divide between the trial court ruling and the Court of Appeals ruling. And these, by the way, if you read the quotes or you listen to the quotes, they sound a lot like facts, don't they? Surgical precision, targeting. I have never seen a case where the Court of Appeals played the role of the trial court, like I did in this case. And I will suspect that the case is going to get overturned if it gets to the Supreme Court on the merits because of what the Fourth Circuit did. I filed briefs in this case. I worked on this case. It was an extremely reckless Court of Appeals decision when compared to the fact finder. And we could talk probably for 2 hours about this particular case and the facts involved. But let me focus on a couple of things. First of all, voter ID. Do I support it? Yes. It should be free and easy to get. Who is going to oppose free and easy to get ID? And if you forget your ID at the polls, well, I don't think you guys have polls here anymore. If you forget your ID at the polls, then you cast a provisional ballot, and you have X number of days to go in and fax in, email, or take a phone picture now and send it to the election official. There's my ID. And so that's something I think is totally reasonable. And I'm always curious, because I do a lot of these talks, why is it such an issue? If you look at polling data, like 85% of Americans agree with voter ID. 85%. I will submit to you that it has become a fundraising tool for certain groups to raise a lot of money to talk about how bad voter ID is and bring cases and pay lawyers and litigate things. If voter ID is free and easy, and easy to get, then I can't imagine why I would oppose it. Now let's talk a little bit about the case. I only have 2 minutes to talk about, or 3 minutes to talk about what is an extremely complicated issue. Have any of you guys had the Voting Rights Act in law school? You guys do that here? Election and Voting Rights Act, Section 2? Okay. Section 2, and I promise you can spend a semester on this statute. I'll try to do it in 2 minutes. You have to show that a particular election device resulted in, and that's the key word, resulted in, a denial of equal opportunity to participate in the political process. It was an amendment in 1982 to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. If I was teaching this, I would take up the first 2 classes, what I just told you. Okay, notice I said resulted in. What the trial court said in the North Carolina case, and by the way, the Virginia case and a bunch of other cases, not in Texas, said that everybody has equal opportunity to get this ID. There's nothing inherently stopping people of particular races from getting this ID. Now, people of particular races might not possess ID at like 1% difference in other races. For example, in South Carolina, the difference is 1.6% difference. 90% versus 91.6%. Okay? The court ruled in the trial court that there has to be a denial of equal opportunity. Like there's barriers. When you come to register to vote, the questions change. That was what was happening in 1964. Okay? But in this case, in North Carolina, the trial court ruled that everybody can get this ID. It's free. Just come on and get it. In other states, they actually sent a bus out to Georgia to go deliver it. So state election officials are sometimes bending over backwards to get the ID to people for free. In Virginia, they mailed it out to you, to your last voting address. What happened was when we got to the Fourth Circuit, and now I'm about 5 classes into your voting rights class. What happened in the Fourth Circuit, the court said, we're looking at the statistical impact. Sort of like employment law. You guys, anybody had an employment law, discrimination law? You know the disparate impact stuff that goes on in that other area of the law? The Fourth Circuit kind of imported it into voting law, which had never been done before. Had never been done, where disparate impact theory went into Voting Rights Act theory, because otherwise it would probably be unconstitutional. Remember, states control their own elections. And Congress never incorporated disparate impact theory into voting law. So when you hear things like, well, minorities had voter ID at 90% versus 91% among whites, that's disparate impact theory, right? That's employment law. That's other kind of law that's not in voting law. Now, will the Supreme Court agree with importing disparate impact theory into Section 2? I don't think they will, because even some liberal justices have rejected the idea in the past. So, with that, I will close.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Adams. Same question to you, Professor Carrasco. What evidence is there of the nation suffering from widespread voter ID fraud?
Well, the premise of the question involved Shelby County versus Holder, which held that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. It required covered jurisdictions to pre-clear their voting changes before they could go into effect. That led to an announcement the following day in North Carolina that there would be an omnibus voting bill that would be introduced. And so North Carolina was no longer covered by the pre-clearance provisions, and following that, they enacted a variety of voting changes. I hate to inform my esteemed colleague, but the district court decision was reversed by the Fourth Circuit, and as last I checked, Court of Appeals decisions are a little bit more weighty than the district court decisions. But in any case, there was a massive record in this case, and the legislature requested data on the use of various voting practices by race before it enacted the law. And to a practice, I mean every single practice that showed that they were used more by African Americans and Latinos than by whites were eliminated. And the practices that were more problematic for Latinos and whites were installed, such as voter ID. These changes, as was mentioned in the question, reflected with surgical precision the reflection of the impact by race on the various practices. These data revealed that African Americans disproportionately used early voting, same-day registration, and now precinct voting, and disproportionately lacked DMV-issued ID. Not only that, it also revealed that African Americans did not disproportionately use absentee voting as whites did. The law drastically restricted all of these other forms of access to the franchise, but exempted absentee voting from the photo ID requirement. In sum, relying on this racial data, the General Assembly enacted legislation restricting all and only practices disproportionately used by African Americans. So the court suggests that the legislature attempted to enact cures for problems that didn't exist. And in fact, the court found that the state has failed to identify, and this is not only the Court of Appeals, but this is relying on findings of the U.S. District Court, the state failed to identify even a single individual who has ever been charged with committing in-person voter fraud in North Carolina. So the court was concluding by saying that in many ways the challenge provisions constitute solutions in search of a problem. The only clear factor linking these various reforms is their impact on African American voters. The record thus makes obvious that the problem the majority of the General Assembly sought to remedy was emerging support for the minority party. Identifying and restricting the ways African Americans vote was an easy and effective way to do so. We therefore must conclude that race constituted a but-for cause of the law in violation of the constitutional and statutory prohibitions on intentional discrimination. Now, although there may be a nuanced distinction between disparate impact and the results test of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the Thornburg versus Jingles test, which the court took great pains to apply very closely, has been used since the Supreme Court decided that case in 1986. So, in any case, in conclusion, just referring back to the research, I would quote my own book, the supplement of 2016, in concluding, recent research has sought to shed light on the two lurking issues in these challenges, the effect of the laws on voter turnout and whether voter fraud is a substantial issue. There seems to be an emerging consensus that there is little evidence of actual voter fraud, and studies have indicated that strict voter identification laws tend to depress turnout among African American and Latino voters. The research is summarized in Christopher Ingram's piece in the Washington Post for February 4th, 2016. There's other findings as well. In fact, in Crawford, there was no evidence at all of voter fraud, and the Supreme Court acknowledged that as well.
All right, thank you, Professor Carrasco. I have a feeling that Mr. Adams is itching to keep talking about this Fourth Circuit case. I just want to give you another minute, and then we'll get to the third question. But The question was, is this a problem, a solution in search of a problem? In other words, the Fourth Circuit found that there just wasn't any evidence of voter ID fraud. And preparing for this, I saw a Washington Post study that looked at a billion ballots cast over about a decade and found 31 that had actual evidence of voter fraud. So is that relevant if we just can't really find real instances of people sneaking into the polls? And why bother with these laws?
I'm always intrigued by the emerging consensus that there's no voter fraud, because they frequently cite studies cataloging voter fraud, and they always omit cases that I've worked on that found voter fraud. So I never take these emerging consensuses very seriously. But let's finish the story of Crawford v. Marion County. We heard a little bit about it. The Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Stewart, in what I believe was a 6-3 decision, said that you don't need evidence of voter fraud to pass prophylactic laws. That a legislature need not have a mountain of in-person voting fraud to pass a prophylactic statute. That is a central holding of Crawford v. Marion County. So you can pass laws simply to, you don't have to have a mountain of securities fraud to pass a securities law. That you think that you might have one instance, Enron might be good enough to re-regulate the energy industry. So the point is that the Supreme Court has addressed this. You know, we heard a very good description of disparate impact theory. Every election law change is going to gore somebody's ox, either white or black or somebody. It will always gore one racial subset's ox. The question is, does it prevent people from voting? That's the central question.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. You gave an extra minute. Of course, I'm all about your time here. Another minute for you. And again, the question is, do we really need evidence of voter fraud before we pass voter ID laws?
Well, I'm going to respond to some of the things that Mr. Adams said. First of all, Justice Stewart had long left the court by 2008 when Crawford was decided. It was decided by a plurality opinion written by Justice Stevens.
Stevens, excuse me.
The opinion did not command a majority of the court. Nevertheless, in Justice Souter's dissent, he said, even the state's interest in deterring a voter from showing up at the polls and claiming to be someone who is not must in turn be discounted for the fact that the state has not come across a single instance of in-person voter impersonation fraud in all of Indiana's history. Neither the district court nor the Indiana General Assembly that passed the voter ID law was given any evidence whatsoever of in-person voter impersonation fraud in the state. And it goes on. It says the absence of support for voter impersonation fraud is replicated in all other parts of the country. So I think also it's important to note that Crawford is of some questionable viability. Justice Scalia filed a concurring opinion, and this case had no evidence supporting any burden on the voters. It was a motion for summary judgment, so the record was really sparse. And given the cases more recently in the Fourth and Fifth Circuits, finding this massive record of evidence indicating discrimination through these voter devices, I think that we've seen the last of Crawford.
All right, thank you, Professor Carrasco. I want to switch to the politics of the issue now. And switching the order again, we'll start with Professor Carrasco for his first 5 minutes. And the question is this. Stricter voting restriction requirements tend to be supported by Republican legislators, while weaker voting registration requirements tend to be supported by Democratic legislators. For example, Oregon's new voter motor law, which basically registers everybody who goes to the DMV unless they opt out, took effect earlier this year after receiving Democratic support. So each side of this debate accuses the other of improper motives. Republicans are accused of trying to suppress the minority vote, while Democrats are accused of artificially expanding their voter base through loose requirements. Professor Carrasco, who has it right?
Well, I think the way the question is phrased, neither is correct. I think that essentially the National Voter Registration Act reflects the objectives of the country in terms of voting. In the preamble, it says that Congress finds that the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote is a fundamental right. It's the duty of the federal, state, and local governments to promote the exercise of that right. And finally, discriminatory and unfair registration laws and procedures can have a direct and damaging effect on voter participation in elections for federal office and disproportionately harm voter participation by various groups, including racial minorities. The fact is that in many of these cases, these laws have been enacted on a straight party vote. In Indiana, all the Republicans voted in favor of the voter ID law at issue there. All the Democrats voted against it. In Vesey versus Abbott, the case decided in July in the Fifth Circuit, the court recognized that there was a concern by the Republicans in the state legislature that unless they enacted these voter suppression laws, they might be voted out of office, because Texas is now majority minority. There are more Africans and Latinos combined than white voters in Texas. The question is somewhat misleading because it refers to this artificial expansion of a voter base through loose requirements. The requirements are not loosened at all. I mean, people still have to be U.S. citizens to vote. They still have to aver under penalty of perjury that they are citizens. And if they're not, they're subject to felony prosecutions. Moreover, with respect to the undocumented, most of these folks, as recognized in Vesey v. Abbott, don't want to go close to a government authority. They're not going to risk their necks and go cast a ballot without eligibility. They're just not going to do that. And there's no evidence. I have not heard of any evidence that undocumented people are doing that. And, I hear the evidence from Old Dominion College in Virginia about this, but the research that I've looked at does not indicate that at all. And I'd be very surprised to see any persuasive evidence that indicates that. And also, I've not heard of any prosecutions with respect to that.
All right, thank you, Professor Carrasco. Mr. Adams, 5 minutes, same question to you. Both sides are playing politics with the issue. Who is correct?
Rhode Island enacted voter ID through a Democrat-controlled legislature and Democrat governor because voter fraud was affecting Democratic primaries, and everybody in Rhode Island knew it. They had massive problems in Providence. It's not just a Republican issue. We always hear there's no evidence of voter fraud. I talked about a study we did just 2 weeks ago where we got the names of aliens who were voting, period. Just because there's not a federal prosecution doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means you have lax federal prosecutors who aren't bringing the cases they ought to be bringing. You're a gambler or a soothsayer who can divine the political winds and guess which way a government official is going to go? Or are you here because you crave certainty? Are you here because you want to be able to look up the answer and argue to a judge, this is what the law is? Look, there have been plenty of civilizations around the world that men made the decisions. There have been plenty of examples through history where a particular king or emperor could decide whatever he wanted to be the law on a whim. But see, one of the great advancements of human history is a parliament that passes laws with certainty and says, if you do certain things, you'll be punished. That's what creates stability in civilization. That's what creates order and all of your ability to prosper and enjoy domestic tranquility. Remember that funky concept that's in the Constitution? Domestic tranquility is a direct product of obeying the law and having law mean something. There's no domestic tranquility in lots of places around the world because men are making the decisions about what the rules are on whims. So to have a situation where we have borders and you can't cross the borders and stay without complying with certain laws, and then to have individuals just suspend those laws on a whim. These are dangerous things. These aren't just well, it's the right thing to do, or it feels good, or what about all those poor children? It doesn't work that way. That's what legislatures are for. And I know you guys are studying hard, you're in school, but I'm telling you, around the country, I travel all around this country, and there's a pervasive feeling that we're coming unglued on these issues, where the law no longer matters. And today it might feel good that all of your dreamers or DACA immigrants are getting in, but tomorrow your ox might be getting bored, because you're on the wrong side of the whim of the leader. You're on the wrong side of the prevailing political winds. And it might be, what if it's the FACE Act? Anybody know what the FACE Act is? Federal Abortion Clinic Entrance Protections. What if the next Republican president says, I'm not going to enforce the FACE Act? Come on, bring your mob out to beat people up or trying to go exercise their right to choose. It could happen just like that. Once you accept the premise that law can be suspended by the executive, like this is happening in this question, all bets are off. And why are you here? Are you here to guess what the next president or the next governor is going to say what the law is? Or are you here to read the books and study the statutes and read the cases? Because if you want to live in the other world, there are plenty of places around the world like that, where you can go and live under arbitrary rulers. And plenty of times around history where the law was kind of like a suggestion. You know, like, well, we passed a statute, but, the king says something different. It's a very dangerous divide. And this DACA issue is one that illustrates it. And, we hear all the excuses why it's okay and so on and so forth. But I'm telling you, there's a bigger issue at play. And it gets to really, why did you want to go to law school? Do you want to go and live in a country and practice law where, you know the judge, you might get a great ruling? None of us like that. It's one thing to know the judge, it's another to get rulings off of that knowledge. Or do you want to know the president and know the administration well, and therefore your company gets a free ride? Or maybe your Gibson guitar, and you said the wrong thing, and next thing you know, you have agents knocking down your door. That's not what America's all about. America's based on certainty in the law. And if you're here illegally, and you're here knowingly illegally, no king, emperor, president, or bureaucrat has the power to say what the law is. The law is the law. And otherwise, why are you here?
Thank you, Mr. Adams. All right, final question to Professor Carrasco. Same question. Arguments for, or against, I'm guessing for, the President's deferred action, which, by the way, I should have said is the President's decision to not deport to groups of unauthorized.
Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. The statute provides the Secretary shall be responsible for establishing national immigration enforcement policies and priorities. It's been determined that there are approximately 11.3 million undocumented folks in the United States. There's no way that the current DHS budget can fund the removal of all those undocumented folks. And so what they have done, in accordance with the priorities established by Congress, is to decide to prioritize the removal of dangerous criminal aliens and national security risks. And so, in light of that, they have also deemed the deprioritization of people who are related, basically the parents of the folks who have U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent resident status. The DACA program confers no legal status on those parents. They do not adjust their status to lawful permanent resident. They don't get even lawful temporary residence. They don't get conditional permanent residence. They get no legal status that is enduring. Their status is basically a decision not to remove them at this time. The benefit of this is that undocumented people come forward and are known not only to the national government, but also to the state governments. What better way to regulate criminal conduct than to know the identity of people and where they are? The state of Texas objects that we're now going to have to give these folks driver's license driver's licenses because we subsidize driver's licenses for Texas, for Texans, and they're going to be eligible under this status. Well, Texas can choose to subsidize their driver's licenses or not. That's really beside the point. Also, this is a matter of prosecutorial discretion. You learned about that in your criminal law cases. Essentially, the government has decided not to go forward with removal proceedings for this particular group of people. It doesn't mean that they are granted legal status, they're not granted any kind of ability to adjust their status in the future by being given this this reprieve from removal. The President has authority to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That includes prosecutorial discretion. The President has the authority to direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to use his statutory authority to decide how the priorities of enforcement should be undertaken. And that's exactly what the DACA program does. Also, there's a question of whether this should be subject to the notice and comment rules of the Administrative Procedure Act. This is not a regulation that is a blanket granting of status. This is a case-by-case determination that these individuals are not dangerous, they've not been involved in criminal activity, and they're not risks to the national security.
All right, thank you, Professor Carrasco. That ends the formal part of our 4 questions we had prepared. We'd now like to change it over to questions from the audience. Trevor will take those. If you pass them in, we'll get to as many as we can. And while we're doing that, I guess I'll throw the first question out. The Oregon experiment, which you sound like you're not too much of a fan of. Can you do voter ID with vote by mail, or is that is it just sort of like submit the form and look at the signature and that's the best we can do?
If you want to get into devising a better system, it would work like this. When you get your voter registration card or whatever they send out, you get a unique verifier number or a PIN. You can pick your own. And so when you do the vote by mail, you have your own unique PIN that only the election officials have. Maybe Oregon has that. I don't think they do. That's one way to do vote by mail with some validation process. Other states, you attach a photocopy or email even a photo ID. But I like the PIN idea, that you pick a PIN and that way it walks down the ballot to you where only you can fill it out. Lafayette Keaton could not have filled out his son's ballot because he wouldn't have known his PIN in theory, although I know my wife's PIN for ATM card.
All right, wow. Everyone's got a question here. This is
Can I just make a brief remark
Sure,
about this? The National Voter Registration Act specifically authorizes the use of vote by mail. So, and it doesn't condition that on any kind of voter ID or proof of citizenship, other than an averment of U.S. citizenship under penalty of perjury.
Okay, thank you. So we'll try to do lightning round here, and I'm not sure we'll get to everybody's, but actually this one, I had the same question, so by definition it must be a very good question. And that is, Mr. Adams, would you be in favor of making a National Voter Day, which would be a federal holiday? And I'll preface that by saying, I moved here from California. I like the civic thing of waiting in line with the old lady, too. I really do, and I miss that. Oregonians love their vote by mail, but I would rather the wait in line thing. The problem with the wait in line system is there are lots of mostly working class people who can't get to the polls during the hours they're open. And there are lots of other countries that actually make it a holiday. So would you favor that?
Yeah, I think that's actually, if we can make a trade to get rid of vote by mail and early voting and have 2 days of election, I'd be in favor of that. I think there was some, you guys, you got to realize 40 years ago or 30 years ago, I don't want to sound like the old man that I'm not, there were unifying forces in America, right? Now you kind of have a Super Bowl, that's about the closest there is, sort of the Olympics. But, Music even. I mean, I remember big radio stations. Everybody knew the same songs, no matter whether it was Michael Jackson or whomever, or Bruce Springsteen. The point is, Election Day is one of these things that I think could be a unifying force. Whether you run it over a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever. I think it's a good thing, and it helps cut down on voter fraud because it's transparent. People can stand and watch. Everybody sees the system going on. I did a voter fraud prosecution when I was in the Justice Department. It's in the federal SUP, FSUP. You can look it up. It's on the United States versus Ike Brown. You can read the case. When you say there's no voter fraud, go ahead and read this case, and you'll never say that again. Where the absentee ballots were the problem, which is essentially vote by mail, where strong-arm tactics were being used by political leaders to force people to vote a certain way. And I just think it's better to have the process out in the open that's transparent.
Just a quick response. Voter ID requirements don't respond at all to voter fraud committed in the mail.
Okay.
So,
does that mean we don't have voter ID because it doesn't affect vote by mail? I mean,
yeah, and if I wanted to trade voter ID laws for federal holidays for voting, I would do that.
Actually, voter ID does work. There are states that do use, Kansas uses a voter ID for mail ballots. So it actually would make a difference.
All right, next question, I think, is to Professor Carrasco. Do you think that strict enforcement of voter ID laws that minorities and many academics believe disproportionately impact them undermine these groups' belief and faith in the rule of law? And isn't that more damaging than the rule of law than lax enforcement of voter laws?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't think so. I think that people have trust that people will be truthful when they certify that they're a citizen and they cast a ballot. And, you know, history has shown that that's the case. There has been very little, what did you say, 31 in a billion votes? I mean, that's, I think that's pretty accurate. So, you know, I really don't think that it undermines the rule of law, and I think that most people of color would say that they are most adversely affected by these requirements, and I think the record in Veazey v. Abbott, I commend it to your reading. The Fifth Circuit case was decided in July. Just, you know, really reflects that conclusion and documents. And also, the North Carolina case, also decided in July, thoroughly documents the impact and the difficulties that people of color, particularly poor people of color, face. And there's a corresponding correlation between economic deprivation and the lack of ability to cast a vote because of inability to get the documents, to get to the place where you get the documents, to afford the documents that are needed to cast a ballot. So this is not me saying it, this is the U.S. Courts of Appeals concluding this.
We haven't mentioned the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which of course went the exact opposite direction. But that's another topic. Here are some other facts. Turnout went up among people of color in North Carolina after voter ID passed. That's a fact. Turnout went up with a voter ID requirement. It was in effect for a primary election and a general election. The data show turnout went up among minority voters. Secondly, most people of color support voter ID. Every single poll that's been done on this, every single poll, look it up. Whites, blacks, Hispanics, all majority support for photo ID. It's a fact. The only group that doesn't support in majority numbers, white Democrats. That's it. Majority support among minorities. Look up the data. There's been polling done on this. There's no contrary data on poll support, public support for voter ID among minority groups.
The courts have found that voter turnout went up because of Obama's
Obama wasn't on the ballot. This was in recent North Carolina elections. It was in the 2015 election in North Carolina with voter ID enforced. Turnout went up among minority voters.
All right, next question, I think is to Mr. Adams. How do our votes get canceled out by non-citizens? Isn't that assuming that non-citizens would vote opposite the way we vote?
They're going to vote opposite somebody's vote, right? Somebody's vote's going to get canceled when an illegal vote is cast.
All right, thank you. Another question for Mr. Adams. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Colombia. I, alongside my parents, achieved lawful U.S. citizenship through a long, expensive, emotional, and arduous process. I know firsthand the trouble that it is to obtain citizenship in this country. What do you believe is the motive that these non-citizens have in risking deportation in order to cast a ballot? I see no tangible benefit for these non-citizens and see only great risk for them.
Well, take a look at what's going on down in Texas with the politiqueros, I think it's called. The benefit to them is they stop getting hassled by political organizers. They're asked, have you voted yet? Have you voted yet? They face pressures within the community. The facts are that aliens are voting. I mean, we can say, well, there's no credible evidence. There is. You just have to look for it. It's out there. I mean, people say it doesn't exist, and that's a smokescreen from actually getting the data. But it does exist. What's the benefit of them doing that? They get a say, right? They get to vote. There's an intrinsic value to voting. They aren't getting caught. They aren't being prosecuted. So the risk is low. And they're getting hassled by organizers to participate in the political process. Many of them are being signed up by voter registration drives. That's some of the problems we've seen. I've looked at voter registration forms in Harris County, Texas, where the signatures all look the same. Different words, of course, the same handwriting. And these signatures, these voter registration drives are putting pressure on people who are not citizens to register. That's what's happening in reality.
They looked for it in Texas and they couldn't find it, and they certainly had an incentive. They wanted to go pull that.
That evidence would have been presented in that case because that's alien voting, which had nothing to do with the voter ID case. I was just testifying in Austin just a couple of weeks ago, and there is indeed clear evidence of alien participation in the elections. I mean, what if there were? When you finally say, okay, you win on the facts, now let's talk about solutions, or we have this constant moving of the goalposts, like, well, you don't win until you show enough to change an election outcome. Look, I believe I brought Voting Rights Act cases to get African Americans elected in many places around this country. I wish there could be reciprocity on these issues, right? Where there's some give and take, and it's not these ironclad views about it. That's why I think the National Election Day would be a good idea.
But I think the question was about unauthorized immigrants. You were talking about non-citizens.
Yeah, there's both.
There's a huge difference. Do you think the problem is equal that unauthorized immigrants are really lined up to vote?
Look, I mean, what difference does it make if it's 50-50, 40-60? And the answer is yes. I mean, if somebody had a PC and gave me 30 minutes, I can give you a bunch of names of people who've been prosecuted. As a matter of fact, question 12 on the immigration form. Have you ever voted in an election when you're registering? There are people filling that out saying yes. And their immigration lawyers are saying you're going to mess up your immigration status by doing this. We could find the names of unauthorized illegal immigrants who are voting in federal elections. That's a fact. Now, how many do you need before you start to think we need to do something about it? I'd like to know that number. 5, 100, 1,000? Which?
Well, you said that photo ID had nothing whatsoever to do with the undocumented situation, but it has everything to do with it.
There's nothing, because a lot of people are getting photo ID who are non-citizens. In Virginia, for example, we just published a list of 1,046 names of aliens who are registered to vote in Virginia.
You said that, but in Texas, they could not find any documented case involving the voting by non-citizens.
I don't know why that would have been an issue in the Vesey case.
Because they were trying to show voter fraud to support the legality of the photo ID program.
It is utterly fantastical to assert that there is not alien voting in Texas. I have active litigation in federal court in McAllen I just settled a case in Del Rio where we found alien voting. It's simply incredulous. I work on these cases to say that there's not alien voting in Texas. It is a fact.
All right, next question, Professor Carrasco. This is a quote from you. What a better way to curb criminal behavior than finding out where they are? That's, you're quoted that way. But doesn't it follow that unenforced law is really no law at all? They are necessarily, and I think this means unauthorized immigrants, are necessarily involved in criminal activity by being illegal aliens.
Well, good question, and I think that it reflects the reason why in my civil rights litigation class I always, when I get to the immigrants' rights section, remind the students about terminology. Alien is a term of art. It's in the Immigration and Nationality Act, and so it's fair to use the term alien. A person can do something that is illegal, but a person cannot be illegal. Clarifying that, illegal status in the United States, immigration status, is not a crime. So people out of status are not criminals. It's true that technically entry without inspection is a misdemeanor, but it's not a continuing offense. Once the person has effected an entry into the United States and is beyond the border area, they are no longer subject to criminal prosecution for that misdemeanor. They are now subject to civil removal proceedings, which are not criminal in nature. So, and in terms of I think that I was misunderstood in terms of the quote, because law enforcement has objected to conferring driver's licenses on the undocumented for a variety of reasons, but the irony is that if they had driver's licenses, they would be identifiable and locatable by law enforcement in the event that they were suspected of a crime. If they're undocumented, have no state or federal ID, they cannot be located, they cannot be identified. They're not fingerprinted and so forth. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should uphold DAPA and DACA to locate those people and remove them, although that's a risk they take if they apply for those benefits. But you know, the bottom line is that those people are not really subject to criminal prosecution, regardless.
Okay, we've been together about an hour. I want to get a few more questions, but can I ask us to kind of bang through these now as fast as we can, so that I've been a student in your situation and I can see the eyes starting to droop. So we'll bang through these. All right, so the next question, and I think this is actually either of you. Assuming California is not doing a very good job of keeping non-citizens off the voter roll, could California's electoral votes be challenged due to California's allowing non-citizens to vote, I think, in a widespread manner is the question.
Not really.
Okay.
But you know, related to that, there are 8 states that have enacted photo ID laws since the last presidential election. Those 8 states represent 80 electoral votes in the Electoral College in this presidential election. So if we suppress the voters in those states because of these requirements, we might see a difference in result because of that first question.
Next question, Mr. Adams, you asked about, you said the Old Dominion poll, but you said it might be unreliable. Do you in fact have an accurate statistical study or source that empirically shows that non-citizens are getting on the voting rolls in the magnitude that you would have us believe?
I just did one last week. We looked at, it was very simple. You guys can do this yourself. We looked at aliens who got on the rolls in the Commonwealth of Virginia. In 8 counties, we found 1,046. We found that they were voting. Case closed.
How do you identify their status?
How do we identify their status? They were removed for not being citizens. The government identified their status. They admitted they weren't citizens.
Okay.
And they were found to have voted.
Yeah. because we look at their voter history, not tough stuff. I wish more people would do the heavy lifting. But we hear so much about there's no evidence of voter fraud, just as people who say that don't ever look. It's easy to find, and that's only 8 counties. But let me talk about the Old Dominion study. I said I don't think it's reliable because the numbers are so out of just astronomical. I don't want to believe that study's reliable. Really? That's what's really going on. So I don't cite it because it's frightening. It's like hundreds of thousands of votes by non-citizens in American elections. You would think people would want to get to the bottom of whether this is really happening or not, rather than say it doesn't happen.
Next question gets back to where are the numbers, but we're not going to ask you for more studies. Assuming you asked, Mr. Adams, what number would it take for you all to want to restrict or to have stricter ID laws? And the question here is, the ultimate question here is one of judgment. Do you value the low risk of voter fraud over the burdens being placed on historically and currently disenfranchised communities?
Okay, I don't know how many times I can say this. Turnout went up in North Carolina after voter ID. Do we want to talk about theories or facts? Turnout went up in North Carolina. It didn't have anything to do with President Obama being on the ballot. 2014, 2015. Turnout went up after a voter ID requirement among African American voters.
That's my question. Are there other states that you can quote other than just North Carolina?
I'd have to look at South Carolina. I think Virginia went up. These are states that enacted voter IDs.
Immigrants, high populations of undocumented immigrants.
What's that?
What about states with high populations of undocumented immigrants?
Well, I didn't think that was relevant to whether.
It's been part of the entire conversation this evening.
But you can't measure the turnout rates of undocumented
You
immigrants.
just said you could.
You can't measure their turnout rates on a statewide basis, no, because no one's done the study. Find me the data set of undocumented immigrants.
Well, related to turnout, the U.S. Court of Appeals, in the Vesey case, said that notwithstanding the increase in turnout, that's irrelevant to the question of voter suppression. Even if there are more people voting, that doesn't mean that some people were not able to vote. And that's the relevant.
Well, that's interesting. So we're going to avoid empirical data about whether or not turnout went up about the victim class that you cite is the victim of these laws.
There's no
correlation. There's no correlation between whether or not the turnout rates went up among the purported victim class.
No, not among the purported victim class. Overall turnout.
No. Maybe I'll have to say it a third time. Among the purported victim class in North Carolina, African Americans, turnout went up with the existence of the voter ID requirement.
And in the McCrory case, the court said that was correlated to Obama running for office.
You need to read it more carefully.
I think you do.
That's not what was said. This was in a Democrat primary.
Okay.
This was in a primary before the general election.
I'm going to call this the last question. I didn't get to all of them, but they were good. Here's the last one. I have a friend who waited in line in Phoenix for 3+ hours to vote. Many citizens aren't able to spend this much time to vote. Many citizens, underline. How do you solve this problem if not through a mail-in ballot system?
Electronic poll books. It's the simplest way. What you do is you have electronic poll books. You guys probably don't know what that is. What electronic poll books are is it's linked into an ID you get from the election office. And you go in and you swipe. And you're immediately given a ballot. What happens now is Hazel at the check-in is leafing through pages looking for your, well, are you the one on Smith Street or Jones Street? Okay, that's what slows the process down, is the absence of electronic poll books. That's the future. There will be electronic poll books all through the country in 20 years. That's just how it's going to be. Also, I don't know about Arizona, I know Florida has a lot of constitutional ballot questions. When you have these long-winded ballot questions, it slows the process down. Those are the two main things causing long lines.
Just a final remark. I think the most dangerous aspect of voter fraud is not the undocumented person going to the polls and trying to cast a ballot. I think the most dangerous aspect is electronic fraud and the miscalculation through the use of these Diebold voting machines and the manipulation that can occur through that kind of voter fraud. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Diebold was touted by a Republican owner as being manipulable. And this is the most dangerous threat to our democracy, I think, in the coming elections.
I'm relieved to hear that because I usually only get that sort of stuff at like Tea Party stuff in Texas. Like the conspiracy, control the machines from outer space crowd, which there's a huge one.
The aliens.
The aliens. Look, we could have done a whole hour on voting systems, but the worst form of elections is a paper ballot. That's why it's favored by dictators all over the world. You need to have somebody other than humans counting ballots.
All right, well, this human wants to thank you all.